The behaviors of social media users, and the internet by extension, have gradually changed from passive to active utilization of the available platforms. Tapriel and Conwar explained that passive use involved expending, reading, watching, and trading content, while active use encompasses creating content and increased involvement in collaborative platforms. Kietzman and colleagues argue that the Honeycomb framework allows executives or corporates to understand what social media is, the various forms of social media, and how to interact on the various platforms. The framework defines social media using 7 functional building blocks, including identity, conversations, sharing, presence, relationships, reputations, and groups. Understanding each of the 7 blocks, their implications, and how corporates can optimize these implications is very important, because the definition of social media is dependent on how the underlying activities impact some or all of the block. Pereira and colleagues explained that the framework components first appeared in 2003, with the whole idea being understanding how social media works and the requirements of building a new platform. Baccarella and colleagues observed that the Honeycomb framework does not account for the dark side of social media, which includes privacy abuse, fake news, witch hunts, trolling, addictive use, and cyberbullying. Kietzman and colleagues define social media as highly interactive web-based platforms that utilize mobile technology to enable individuals and communities manage social objects through creation, sharing, and interaction with user-generated content. The change in social media user behavior has been accompanied by a democratization of corporate communication, characterized by a shift of power from public relations and marketing professionals to content creators. Particularly, interactions around brands today happen in both the presence and absence of the respective entities. Thus, corporate entities are faced with the decision of either hopping onto social media and be part of the conversations affecting the respective brands or being left behind with the over-reliance on traditional media. The power of social media in the world today is undeniable, but corporate entities and stakeholders are still struggling with developing effective strategies that could leverage the power of the available platforms. Thus, the entities end up mismanaging available opportunities or ignoring them completely. The functional blocks of the Honeycomb framework assist managers in rationalizing the social media ecology, understanding social media users, and addressing the underlying engagement needs. Social media platforms are evolving to stay in the fight for users' attention. Analyzing the ecology of social media uncovers that different sites have optimized various functionalities presented by the Honeycomb framework. This figure presents the various blocks utilized by modern social media platforms. Identity is centrally placed owing to the fact that it is the most basic component of any social media platform. The identity block encompasses the degree to which social media users put their actual real-life identities on the internet. The identities include demographic and all other information that seeks to present users in a certain way, especially in their networks. Pereira and colleagues note that identities uniquely mark each user in a particular system. The presentations of a user's identity happen through self-disclosure of subjective information, which could either materialize in a conscious or unconscious manner. The information includes likes, dislikes, thoughts, emotions, and interesting topics or subjects. Some social media users use their real names, while others have adopted different names that they choose to be known for. Some users develop identity strategies, while others focus on self-branding or promotion. Profiles, especially bios, are the primary source of information for users' identities. The significance of social media identities presents firms with some serious implications for consideration. For instance, privacy is a serious concern for many users, even though they share their information willingly. However, willingly sharing information does not equal consent to information misuse. Corporate entities should not focus on accurate or complete identities, but those that fit the context of the platforms they are interested in. For instance, the information provided on LinkedIn should be different from what is on a Facebook profile, even though it is all about a single entity. Technologies such as OAuth are very important for corporate entities by allowing the provision of fundamental information without having to over-reveal identities. The appropriate balance between an online identity and privacy is essential in choosing the necessary social media strategies, as well as the relevant tools of use. The conversation component of the framework focuses on the degree of interactivity presented by users on social media platforms. This interactivity is measured by the frequency of communication. Pereira and colleagues argue that conversation refers to the resources that facilitate both synchronous and asynchronous communication. Most social media platforms facilitate communication between users, primarily those with created profiles. Conversations on social media platforms occur between individuals, with some users utilizing the platforms in achieving desired change. Firms seeking to either host or track conversations on social media are required to acknowledge format and protocol considerations that inform the attainment of desired outcomes. For instance, the microblogging platform Twitter focuses on creating awareness because of the limited number of characters provided for every post. Services such as Google Replay facilitate the review of tweets, since one conversation could contain up to millions of tweets. These services allow firms to make sense of conversations in real-time fashion to minimize the likelihood of losing an opportunity of maximizing the outcomes of being part of a particular conversation. The frequency and quality of conversations on social platforms is of particular interest to corporates, primarily through monitoring the velocity of a conversation. According to Kietzman and colleagues, velocity in this case refers to the speed and direction of changes in a particular conversation. Appropriately tracking conversations allows firms to positively manipulate them in their favor, a phenomenon that potentially increases market reach and guides consumer interaction. Sharing refers to the possibility of exchanging objects, mostly user-generated content, that could be useful for users. Sharing is similar to conversation but instead focuses on content as opposed to message, and is determined by the frequency that users interact with content. This frequency is measured through users' reception and distribution of content. The sociality of social media users is also determined by the various social media aspects that inform interaction, including shared objects, such as user-generated multimedia. Sharing is just a single component of social media functionality, but it informs the materialization of other components in the framework. For instance, sharing determines whether users in a particular network want to start conversations or build relationships. Corporates can leverage the sharing functionality of social media by determining the objects that increase user activities, such as conversation. Effective sharing promotes interaction among users, even in instances where they are not exactly interested in building relationships. Thus, corporates seeking to share objects online are required to determine what informs user sociality and determine the objectives of the platform. For example, Twitter is a microblogging site with video and image functionality, Instagram is a digital album for storing images or photographs, and YouTube is a video sharing site. The extent of sharing is also an important consideration for corporates who seek to effectively use social media. The free nature of most social media platforms exposes content creators to copyright infringements and misinformation. Talwar and colleagues maintain that hearing news instantaneously increases awareness and raises the risk of sharing fake news primarily due to lack of religiosity and time to countercheck shared information. The lack of time and religiosity also minimizes the effect of authenticating news on reducing the frequency of sharing fake or unsubstantiated information. The authors also suggest that social media users who primarily focus on corrective action rarely share fake news. The strategies applied by sites such as YouTube to regulate the extent of sharing content include providing terms of use for users seeking to generate content, availing a content management system for owners, allowing the flagging of inappropriate content, and taking down content that violates community guidelines. Presence allows users to determine the accessibility of other users. The connectivity of the world today ensures that social media presence bridges the gap between the real and the virtual worlds. Pereira and colleagues assert that presence refers to the resources that facilitate the determination of whether an identity is online or not. Presence-oriented network sites focus on geographical spaces as opposed to specific locations. Friends Around Me functionalities on sites such as Facebook and Twitter allows users to find others in their network who are within the same geographical location. Kietzman and colleagues identify Trapster as another presence-oriented platform that alerts drivers of police speed traps and speed cameras. Firms seeking to optimize social media use for their growth are required to determine the importance of user availability and location. This determination is facilitated by continuous interaction, especially through shared content. Selective presence also offers an important consideration based on the accessibility of users' profiles. Presence is associated with conversations and relationships since they altogether determine the degree of interaction. The relationship component of social media functionality focuses on the associations between users that inform interaction. Pereira and colleagues assert that relationships determine how users relate online. For instance, users on Facebook relate through friending, while Twitter users relate through following. Relationships in the contexts of social media are determined by objects that guide a wide range of interaction, from following or befriending one another, to meeting physically. Central to the relationships formed on social media is information exchange. The purpose of a platform structures and regulates the nature of relationship by users who have connected. For example, people in a similar network on LinkedIn can determine each other's locations for professional purposes. Thus, relationships on the platform are maintained as opposed to being expanded. Kietzman and colleagues note, and I quote, "The general rule is that social media communities which do not value identity highly, also do not value relationships highly," in explaining the nature of relationships on platforms such as Twitter and YouTube. The authors also highlight the importance of relationship attributes, that is, structure and flow, as drawn from the social network theory. Structure identifies the number of relationships one user is involved in, with increase in the number of connections being associated with influence. Flow refers to the nature and applicability of resources involved in connections. Particularly, resource applicability refers to the degree to which the resources can be transformed, exchanged, or used. Depending on the nature of resources, social media relationships are either strong or infrequent. Corporates are required to establish new relationships and maintain already existing ones. Formally structured relationships should require authentication, broken structures might require legal intervention, and identification is important in maintaining relationships. The creation of meaningful relationships is dependent upon users' intentions of growing social media networks. Reputation determines users' stances on social media. Online reputations are largely founded on trust, but the fluid nature of social media platforms guides the determination of profile trustworthiness based on tools that automate the aggregation of user information. Pereira and colleagues assert that reputation enables the determination of a user's status, including whether they are trustworthy or not based on the information or content they share. Reputation includes both user information and the nature of shared content. Likes and ratings are used in presenting the authenticity of user-generated content across various social media platforms. Firms and users who value their reputations and those of others utilize specific metrics that inform the identification of authenticity. Kietzman and colleagues argue that followers on Twitter and Instagram and subscribers on YouTube could indicate a person's popularity but not necessarily the viewership of their content. Thus, engagement by corporates on social media should rely on a solid reputation system that accounts for the number of posts, activities, time, and rating systems as the preferred metrics. Using collective intelligence or objective data for evaluation allows firms to track online conversations involving them through metrics such as strength, sentiment, passion, and reach as outlined by Kietzman and colleagues. Strength is the frequency of being mentioned, sentiment is the ratio between positive and negative comments, passion is the frequency of being involved in conversations, and reach is the function of the number of users involved in mentioning a company divided by the overall frequency of being mentioned. Groups refer to the degree to which users, through their connections, form online communities. Pereira and colleagues maintain that groups present the possibility of social media users creating communities based on opinions, ideas, or interests. The sociability of a network is defined by the number of friends, followers, and contacts. Kietzman and colleagues explain that the cognitive limit of human beings restricts the number of actual stable relationships they could be involved in to 150. The fact that social media connections surpass 150 by far necessitates the use of tools to maintain created connections. The tools allow users to either create self-selected groups or lists of close friends from all the existing connections, or be part of offline analogous groups, characterized by being secret, closed, or open to anyone. Online communities primarily group their users to avoid the burden of group members having to sort through lists of contacts. User-generated groupings improve the ease of optimizing the use of groups for online connectivity. Formal group rules and functions are required for groups or communities seeking to grow their membership. Groups, beyond the involved users, are also defined by the shared content and the underlying activities. Filtering group content and information is fundamental in optimizing the functionality of groups owing to the volume of information shared on social media. The nature of groups vary with the content users are allowed to share, user identity differences, permissions, systems flexibility, user management, and categorization. Corporates could highly benefit from using the categorization of groups based on context by reducing the need to sort through massive lists.